Bhagavan Sri Ramana Maharshi, speaking as the Satguru, in the first line of the first writing declares, all living beings seek happiness always. Today we'll focus just on human beings. The reason why we seek happiness always is that we know deep within and sometimes feel our real nature, which is the most extreme and infinite happiness. And the most infinite wisdom and understanding, and that this state is the true nature of all that is. And in the second line, Sri Ramana states that it is happiness, real happiness, and happiness alone, the happiness that comes from Satchidananda, that is the cause of love. So what we can deduce from these two lines is the closer the consciousness is to its real nature, the happier it feels, and therefore the more love it feels and expresses and abides in. And love is the expression of bliss, the bliss of our real nature that is unchanging always. And because it is unchanging and never lost, the happiness never disappears and there is no suffering. This is the grace of God. We are offered a life free of suffering and filled with love. And yet, very few human beings accept this offer. So, we must understand, therefore, that the human being has been hypnotized by a false paradigm, a false, mistaken understanding of what it is, and therefore cannot reach happiness and refuses the happiness in the form of grace that the self, because God is the self, not an other, is always offering. And prefers its suffering, its misery. And therefore, life lived in ignorance will be a life with very few crumbs of illusory happiness that is usually a temporary thrill brought about by a momentary drug, whether it's chocolate or it's mushrooms or something like that on the spectrum, but always temporary and always with a backlash, and always causing a deterioration in the health of the body. And these false forms of happiness become the objects of addiction. And the more one is addicted, and addicted means enslaved, the weaker one becomes, and the less able to overcome the ego's ignorance, willful ignorance, and rejection of the bliss that can be and is always provided by our benevolent real nature, the self, who is God. And because God is all there is, and there is nothing but God, it cannot be that your real nature is anything but that. But the ego has no interest in knowing it, and no interest in receiving the real bliss, because it prefers its jouissance. It prefers pleasure that becomes pain to the bliss that never ends. And so the only time that the human being actually feels Satchidananda is in deep sleep. And that's why when someone wakes up from a very deep sleep, they feel happy momentarily until the human ego takes over. But they do, and they recognize it. They say, I slept very well. But because there was not a tension in sleep, there was no vritti jnana during that time, there is no conscious recognition that they touched into their true nature in deep sleep, and that they can very easily remain in that true nature when the body's awake. Because it has nothing to do with the state of the body's consciousness. It's the state of the self, which is bodiless. But deep restful sleep in Satchidananda has no effect upon the waking ego. And the more one is stuck in one's jouissance, the more one will have dreams, mostly dreams that are unpleasant, that cause anxiety. And one will not even be able eventually to reach deep sleep. And it's an epidemic of sleep disorder in which people cannot sleep. They require massive amounts of sleeping pills. But the sleeping pills actually don't get you into the deep, restful sleep. They'll space you out. But those who take them don't wake up the same way one wakes up from a restful, deep sleep, especially if one has gone to sleep with love of God and hope of being able to know that Satchidananda in the midst of that deep sleep. And often that will be granted to those whose love for God is strong enough to overcome the natural inattentiveness of the ego in deep sleep. So, for those who become awakened at least to the fact that their real nature is Satchidananda, and wonder why their lives don't reflect that, or they never feel it, and wonder why their karma is getting worse and actually providing more pain and less pleasure even, because at some point the tipping point is reached and the addictions don't bring it. They don't bring any pleasure, because one needs larger and larger doses, and in between one's in withdrawal sooner, there's more complaints, and the ego lives in a state which will eventually cause it to overdose if its pleasure requires a major severe drug, an opioid, heroin, which it often will lead to in the cases where the ego is most hardened against its own happiness and against love. And so life becomes an ever more steep downward spiral into a hell realm. And yet the ego steadfastly denies this fact, even though everyone else can see it. But the ego will not budge from its rejection of its own self and its rejection of bliss. So, that forces then the benevolent mercy of God not to reach you, and therefore the predetermined fate of the ego cannot be prevented from coming in its full, worst, raw level of pain. And we see that all the time, although the ego says, well, that won't happen to me. But it does. So, therefore, when one enters into a spiritual path and becomes at least intellectually aware of their real nature, and realizes it's in their own interest to overcome the ego, that the ego is your enemy, not your friend, and not who you are, but who you've been hypnotized by the mind, the ego mind, and the indoctrinations of other ego minds, and have become loyal to that false construct, that there is a way out, which is simply through becoming loyal to God rather than to the ego and all of the ego's vices, its vasanas, its attachments, its addictions. And the more the ego is willing to give up its own desires, that healthy part of the ego, that symbolic part connected with the soul that knows it needs to find God, it needs to become liberated from its own enslavement to suffering, has the power, the more of that margin of recognition is present in the waking state, to have the self-discipline to weaken the addictions, to change, to grow, to let go of the greed for the chakra 1 food signifiers, and for the attachment to bodily beings and the desire for the momentary sexual pleasure that always leads to devastation and a complete recognition and a feeling of one's failure as a man or as a woman. But then one wants to prove it even more in the next relationship, which then crashes one even worse and weakens the willpower then for the ego to gain the self-discipline to be able to let go of its addictions or have them let go of the ego. And the more one recognizes that it is in one's own interest to change and to oppose one's own ego's desires, the more strong one becomes, the more one receives grace, happiness, love, the heart opens, and the ability to do things that seemed impossible, which could include changing even one's diet, or some lesser change that's in one's immediate physical benefit and mental benefit and energetic benefit, one will be able to overcome these bad habits. And the more one lets go of them, the more strength one receives, the happier one becomes, the more energy one has, because prana comes from the Shakti of God's grace. And the better life gets, and you're in an upward spiral. And soon you will be able to let go of all those attachments of the ego, which is in a way playing the role of the devil in Christian mythology and other dualistic mythologies. Or we could say it is Ravana, the 10-headed head of the commander of the demons who steal the soul. And one is able to take the refuge with Rama and be rescued back into God consciousness and freed from one's suffering. But the key, if one wants to be free from one's enslavement to the ego, is that you need the help of Hanuman. Hanuman is the key player in this game, because Rama himself doesn't change, doesn't move, doesn't interfere. If you don't love Rama, Rama is not going to care. It's your loss, it's not Rama's loss. Rama's offering, Rama's mercy is always there, but if you're not asking for it, if you're not loving Rama, well, is he going to send Hanuman to help you? No. Because you don't want that help. You prefer to be in the grip of Ravana. That's a choice. And so life is a battle. And in every authentic scripture, it's depicted as a battle. But Rama doesn't do the fighting. And in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna doesn't do the fighting. It's Arjuna who has to carry on the fight. But Arjuna couldn't win the fight if Krishna wasn't in his chariot. And it's that pact we make with God of love and loyalty that gives us the strength to overcome the enemy, which is the ego. So Hanuman represents the upper death drive, the will to let go of the ego, to transcend, and to attain one's rightful status as a manifestation of God. But it's only rightful if one wants to exercise that right, and the ego rejects it. It prefers the right to suffer. And so God gives the free will to have what one wants. So the more that one takes the side of the ego in one's life and believes what the ego mind is telling one, then the more clearly likely it is you're going to lose the battle. And in fact, for some, it's not even a battle because they have submitted fully to Ravana. And therefore, the destiny cannot be changed. But those who seek Hanuman's help will find that, like Hanuman, their heart is always open. And because their heart is open with love for God, they receive the full power, the full intelligence, the full bliss of God's presence as the self. And they become easily and miraculously liberated. And even liberation, of course, is an illusion because the real self is always in that state. It was only the illusion of enslavement that one gave into that created the illusory problem in the first place. But that illusory problem for the ego is very real and becomes very painful. So the soul burdened with a negative ego alone cannot retrieve itself from that capture. Sita could not have freed herself without the help of her love for Rama and her remorse for having allowed herself to be captured by Ravana, and without her seeking the help of Hanuman and activating, therefore, Hanuman's invincible power as a spiritual warrior to overcome this evil lower nature that forces us into a hell realm of suffering, but that we voluntarily agree to enter. So those who realize they can't do it alone, and they can't reach Rama directly, because you can't meditate when you're in an ego state, and you don't have the willpower to let go of the vasanas and the lifestyle of the ego, unless there's a dharma, and you voluntarily enter into a situation where you put yourself under the dharma and under the direction of a guru. But the ego will not do that. The ego that is on the side of Ravana does not want to feel controlled. It will not recognize that what it's misinterpreting as control is actually an opportunity to be taught how to be free. You're under the control of the devil now. That control one doesn't mind, because it's the devil, the ego, speaking in the voice that you believe is your own. And so long as you believe that voice, there is no way out, because you are believing a mind that is a demonic mind that has your worst interests in its intention. And so the more one does have that view of the ego, shares the ego's paranoid, negative view, and its over-optimistic view of its own power that it knows is ridiculous. It has never been able to get out of its trap so far through its life, and by the time it reaches mid-adulthood, it's pretty obvious that without getting some assistance, the situation is going to be hopeless. And that's why God, the self, provides gurus. And if you are intelligent enough and clear enough to recognize the voice of a Satguru, you can read Ramana, and you don't need to go to an ashram, you don't need to go under a dharma, because the teachings are enough. But there are very few people for whom the teachings are enough. And so, to put oneself in a situation where one is being helped, not controlled, but assisted with good advice and with a dharma that encourages one to follow that advice, because one's in a community of others who are hopefully, to some extent, in the love of God and in the wisdom that for their own sake they must overcome the ego. They ask for that help, and the more they are surrendered to the help that is coming, the sooner they become free of any dependency or any control, because they become God conscious. That's the only way you're free of control. The only question is, who do you want to be controlled by? The devil or by God? Okay. So, those who are most, let's say, earnest, most yearning, most ripe, most surrendered, will appreciate the fact that a guru is naturally going to be most strict with those students who are most advanced. And those students will recognize that the strictness is a gift. Now, with the students who are not ready to have self-surrender, let alone surrender even of a food signifier, and don't want to be told how they should live, then they will reject that. And when the teacher is strict, they will feel attacked. And they will feel insulted. And they will say back, I'm in the ego. I'm not ready to hear this. Well, to say I'm in the ego means I'm in the clutches of the demon and I'm going to stay there, thank you. And so when that happens, the teacher says, fine, I will soften, I will let go, I will no longer be strict. But then clearly you're no longer a true student, and you'll be treated accordingly. And then your own predetermined fate as an ego will control your destiny. And so everyone makes their own choice, and the teacher never forces anyone to be under control, and everyone's always free to leave, and as you have seen, they do. And there's no problem, there's no judgment, there's an acceptance. This is the ego's world, and as long as the ego wants to live in its world, so be it. It's no loss to the teacher. So, the teacher has no interest in controlling anyone. The teacher is abiding in the love and the bliss of God and wanting to share it. If that's what control is, then I'm happy to be under the control of Sri Ramana and of his teachings and of his advice, and to follow it as impeccably as possible, because I know that's in my best interests. And the more that I would overcome any residue of an egoic samskara, the more blissful I am, and the more life becomes joyous. So this is a matter of one's own capacity to think clearly and to want what is best for oneself. And the more one does, the more one will love God, the more one will feel love for one's phenomenal self and treat the body better, and the more that one will experience that love in its most direct and beautiful form in every moment. So to win the battle requires surrender. Ultimately, not simply the surrender of eating food that'll make you sick, but the surrender of the ego itself. The surrender of the vasanas is not the point. You can lead a very healthy life. You can be a fruitarian and still be in the grip of the devil. That has nothing to do with it. But by letting go of one's attachment to those bad foods, one is letting go of the capture by Ravana. If one enjoys fruit, then that's not the problem. But I'm sure one is addicted to other aspects of the ego that will keep one from the bliss. It's not simply a matter of food. That's the least of it. That's chakra 1. What about the other 5 before you get anywhere close to who you really are? So all of this is the preliminary level of the shifting of the locus of our consciousness from the ego to the real self. If you're not interested in shifting that and knowing while alive, which is the only time you can know it, the bliss, the intelligence, the willpower, the strength, the infinite nature, the eternal nature of who you are, then you're free to pass it up. And you're also free to accept it, and you will receive it. And this is the question that every soul must face. And it's a matter of one's own conscience, and one's capacity to think clearly, and one's willingness to go beyond thought into the bliss that requires a silent mind. And the silence can only come when one is determined to remain totally surrendered to God. That's what surrender means. I prefer silence to thought. Silence is presence, thought is pain. It's very simple. If one chooses to be in the ego, one is choosing painful thoughts, negative projections, illusions, paranoia, projections that will then distance one ever further from the very sources of help that are being offered. And so this is why very few egos, very few, let's say, consciousnesses in the grip of an ego are able to take the choice of their free will in order to become liberated sages and blissful beings. But for each and every one of us, it's equally possible, if you have the love for God, to attain it easily, quickly, and be able to lead a life that's so miraculous your ego can't even imagine the possibilities. So once you understand the choices you're making, the extreme consequences that either choice will have, and that there is no middle ground. It's all or nothing. It's the ego or it's God. Then the choice becomes clear, and one's own willingness to live in truth, one's ethical duty to overcome the ego, will give one the power to achieve success. Because God is always with you, because God is really who you are. So, that's my delivery of Sri Ramana's sermon today. I hope you take it in the way that it is offered, and not as any kind of punishment or judgment or attempt to brainwash you into being controlled. Okay? I'm trying to free you from a control that is hurting you. And if you don't want that help, so be it. You're free to do what you wish. What your ego makes you think you wish. But I do offer, on behalf of the Satguru, blessings for making the right choice and knowing that supreme happiness that is granted to those souls who are willing to surrender to the one God.